Okay. Let's get the right slide. Thank you for attending my presentation. It's on happiness. I hope you are all happy today. I will talk about happiness in this lecture the coming 30 to 40 minutes, especially in relation to happiness in cities. So what does it mean living in a city? How does it affect our happiness? And what can local governments do to make ourselves feel happier? I'm working in the institute called Erasmus Happiness Economics Research Organization. We were established 2 years ago, and the goal of our organization is basically measuring happiness, looking at the determinants of happiness, but also looking at the consequences of happiness. And so are happy people in the end also really healthier and, from an economic point of view, more productive? The skeptics among you might ask why, well, is happiness a priority topic in Russia? It's not a country that it's well known for its immense happiness. I will show you some figures, but Russia scores in terms of happiness levels, very average in the world. But if you ask Russians what are important aspects of well-being, then you would see that life satisfaction, which is the most important aspect of happiness, ranks amongst the highest priority topics in Russia. It's after health, and then followed by education. And this was a recent study by the OECD held in 2014. So for Russians, happiness is also important, and I will show you also why Russia is not that happy and how we can make Russia a happier place. The call for happiness is not new. It was already established in the 18th century. It evolved from the Enlightenment movement. One key figure, philosopher Jeremy Bentham, he shares one common feature with Lenin in the sense that also his embalsamed body can be found still nowadays in the city of London. Jennifer Bentham's idea, so his political ideas, is that government should strive for the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And that should be the goal when you would make policy. Bentham's ideas became not very popular in politics. So if you would look at the great ideologies of the 20th centuries, this was not utilitarianism. This was more related to church, liberalism, socialism, and nationalism. So for the church, happiness was not a goal at all. Your human life was more about suffering, and happiness could be obtained in heaven. Liberalism was not really against happiness, but more freedom was the most important goal to strive for in terms of liberalism. For socialism, equality was the most important goal. And also when you think happiness and equality, it might go hand in hand, but also happiness, showing happiness might also be showing off in a socialist society, so not really advocated by proponents of socialism. And nationalism was more about the pride of the nation than the happiness of the individual. So more the collective good was also here more important than the individual good. Well, why is happiness nowadays important? We see a demise of competing ideologies. So socialism and nationalism don't play that important role anymore in contemporary society. Liberalism, although it's in the Western world still a very important political stream, it more or less achieved its main goal, namely freedom, and then mainly in terms of economic freedom and political freedom. Then there are also a lot of the world problems, or the main world problems, have been solved, and there's now a call for these positive goals. And that you also see in the public appreciation of happiness. And so also in individual lives, happiness becomes a more important goal, and you see that especially not only in politics, but you also see it in popular media, such as all kinds of magazines, especially in my country, the Netherlands, are showing up that deal with the topic on happiness and how we can become happier. Finally, there's also nowadays greater knowledge about happiness. Happiness is not an easy topic to measure, and I will shortly show how we measure happiness, or at least how you can measure happiness. But since the 1970s, happiness questions have appeared in big social surveys, amongst others the Eurobarometer, which is a big social survey in Europe. You have also the European Social Survey, the World Value Survey, and the Gallup Survey, and they also contain happiness questions. And because they collect data that are representative for countries, we now have nowadays greater knowledge about happiness and the determinants of happiness than that we had in the past. So, in the end, what do we would like to know about happiness? That is basically a first question, and also who wants to know what and why? If we look at individuals, we all would like to know how we can become happier. So a real question for you, but also for me, is what can I do to lead a happier life? But also if you have children, you want especially your children to lead happy lives. So how can I make my children happy? Why do we want to know that? Happiness is something that is highly valued in individual lives. And also, we have nowadays much more choices. So we have increasing freedom, economic freedom, political freedom. We have much more money to spend. But this also brings a lot of more choices that we have to make, especially with regarding to consumption or education. What type of job do we choose? What kind of stuff do we buy? And that also, making bad choices can also result in worse levels of happiness. For governments, happiness is also important. So the government is there in the end to serve the citizen, and the question is in the end, what makes citizens really happy? And what kind of policies do bring the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people? So really in the spirit of Jeremy Bentham. And here the general idea is that happiness is the good thing to strive for, and what citizens want might also be good for the re-election of politicians. So if politicians pursue the right policies or make the right policies that result in a nicer city or a nicer place to live, then they have a higher chance to be re-elected. Apart from that, happy citizens also appear to be better citizens. Happy citizens are usually more healthy, more productive, drink also less alcohol, and make less problems in traffic. So from this perspective, it might also be for local governments an important goal to pursue. But what do we know in the end about happiness? And this will be the main part of my talk. So what is happiness? How can it be measured? How happy are we in the end? And what makes us happy? And how can a city contribute to this happiness? Starting with the first question, what is happiness? What is happiness is not an easy question, because happiness in the broadest sense refers to quality of life, and quality of life is used by different parties for different means. If politicians talk about happiness and quality of life, they are merely talking about the livability of the environment. So they're merely talking about the external quality of life, and they are looking more at the chances for having a good life than the outcomes of a good life. So when we look from a political perspective at the topic of happiness, we mainly talk about livability, so the chances for a good life that are external. Apart from that, there are also, when we talk about liveability, then we look at the internal factors that are internal to individuals and provide a chance to live a happy life. Most simple aspect of liveability is that as an individual, you don't have mental or physical problems. But this liveability might also be related for you as an individual. We refer to the ability to live a happy life. Then there is a quality of life that is more from a utility perspective. So how valuable is your life for the life of others? And that is when we talk about happiness in terms of utility. So this is often expressed by especially a church, as an important or the most important aspect of happiness, that you live a good and proper life. But life, for example, of Gandhi can be called very useful for the rest of humanity in that sense. So that might be a good example. When we look at, in the end, at satisfaction, I'll be talking about happiness, I will be talking in terms of satisfaction. So I will be looking at outcomes of life that are internal. So how much does an individual values his or her life as a whole? When we look at satisfaction, there might be also some tricky aspects about this subject, namely that some forms of satisfaction might be passing, and might only refer to a part of life. So I might enjoy a good glass of wine, I might enjoy the snow outside, go into a snowball fight, but this is just a pleasure. It's a passing experience that only covers a part of life. There are also parts of life that are more enduring. So you can be satisfied with your job, you can be satisfied with your marriage, you can be satisfied with your friends. These are what we call domain satisfactions. These are enduring forms of happiness, but only cover a partly aspect of life. Then there is something that is called a top experience, which is also not happiness in the sense that I use it. So that is satisfaction with life, or a top experience refers to an experience with life as a whole, but it's a passing experience. And these top experiences are often the things that poets write about. This feeling that you're on top of the world, but this feeling is also a feeling that can pass soon away. Finally, there is life satisfaction, which is enduring, and is basically it refers to the evaluation of life as a whole. So how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? Happiness consists of two different aspects. So on the one hand, there's the affective appraisal, and on the other hand, there's the cognitive appraisal of life. When I talk about affective appraisal, I mainly talk about emotions. So I can ask you, how happy do you feel now? And then I'm mainly focusing on your emotional feeling at that moment. Humans can make a quite good assessments of their hedonic level, and they share this also with higher animals. So it's also known from, for example, apes, that they can show this affective appraisal of life. Humans stand out, however, in one other aspect, namely in terms of contentment, which is the cognitive appraisal. So what humans can do is they can compare their ideal life to the life that they currently lead. So they can compare the best possible life with the worst possible life, and that we call the contentment level that you have as a person. And when we look at evaluation of happiness, we are mainly interested here in this contentment aspect. So to summarize, when we look at the concept, we have an overall concept, life satisfaction, which is overall appreciation of one's life as a whole. And then we have two components, the affect level and the cognitive level. This brings us to the question, how can we measure happiness? In science, we often like to measure things in an objective way. With happiness, this is virtually impossible. I can look at you, and you, and make some assessments on how happy you are, but probably I'm completely wrong. I cannot determine that solely by looking at you. There is now some work that looks at nonverbal behavior and physiological functioning. So physiological functioning mainly looks at brain scans to assess happiness. It is already proven that it can to some extent be assessed using neuroscience, but of course it would be a hell of a job to do so and to assess happiness in a large part of the population. Apart from that, then you can also assess happiness basically on nonverbal behavior. Emotions are something, and that's nice about emotions, they are universal. And so you have some basic emotions like happiness, anger, sadness, that wherever you go on the globe, from Papua New Guinea to Iceland, people will have the same expressions. In some societies, these expressions might be more suppressed than in other societies, but these expressions can also be measured by means of videoing or photographing, and also with these techniques there is currently a lot of progress made. These kind of functions are already integrated in apps that can be found on iPhones, and for example the Emotion app I recently heard will also be integrated in the Google Glass that will appear next year on the market. However, how do we measure happiness most of the times is nowadays still by doing surveys. I can indirectly questioning you, that was very popular in the 60s, but not nowadays. So I can ask your friends how happy you are, but this is hardly done at the moment anymore. But what we do is direct questioning. So we can give a global self-estimate, give a single question. So I can ask you, how happy have you been last month, for example, on a scale from 0 to 10? Or I can ask you, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? Happiness questions are sometimes also measured using multiple questions, and then an overall index is made. What is also done is a multi-moment average. To explain that to you, I will show you a question in a moment. This is an example of a survey question. This question is used in the Gallup survey. Please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom the ladder represents the worst possible life. Which step of the ladder would you are? And 1 would be the worst, and 10 would be the best. So this is really a type of question that assesses somebody's contentment level. What is now increasingly popular, and in our institute we are also developing these apps, are measuring happiness through smartphones. This is especially convenient when you would like to measure affect level. So what you, for example, and there we also used it in city research, we call this experience sampling. What you can do is, for example, people can sign up to participate in the survey, and then they get push messages. And these push messages they get at certain points during the day, and then we ask, with whom are you, where are you, and what kind of activity are you doing, and how are you feeling at the moment? And because we are also able to connect it to GPS, you can actually send people certain kind of push messages when they are, for example, at certain places in the city. And so you can, in this way, you can, for example, evaluate how people feel emotionally with experiencing some kind of built environment. How happy are we then exactly? Well, that differs from country to country. What I did for this lecture is focusing a little bit on the contentment question, what we call the ladder question. And if we look at happiness in Moscow, then we also there the people were asked, how happy do you, or imagine the worst and best possible life on a scale from 0 to 10, on which step are you? Well, you see that slightly more than, well, I think it's 20% gives his or her life a 5. On average, the Moscovian citizen gives his or her life a 6 in terms of contentment level. You see that there are very few citizens that are completely unhappy with their life. They give their life a 1, 0, or 2. But there are also citizens in Moscow which are perfectly happy with their life and evaluate their life with a 9 or 10, meaning that their life is at the moment at the best possible imaginable life that there exists. Well, is happiness everywhere so happy? No. So if you, for example, look in Zimbabwe, which is the most unhappiest nation in the world, so people give life there a 4 out of 10 on average. You see that most people also really score low on this contentment question. You see, though, that there are some people still very happy in Zimbabwe, a country that is characterized by war, conflict, and also famine. We can probably imagine who is happiest there, but that is open to speculation. We can make a world map, and the nice thing is for most countries in the world, we now have some form of happiness assessment. You see that typically the happiest countries are found in the northern hemisphere, so northwest Europe, but also you see that Latin American countries are on average very happy countries. Russia scores average, so Russia scores on average a 5.5 out of 10. This is also by any means the world average, and you see that especially countries in Africa, so most notably Zimbabwe and Togo, those score worst in terms of life evaluation. So these people feel that their life is, in some cases or in much cases, very close to the worst possible imaginable life. If we compare different world cities, and what we now did is not focusing on countries, but make some kind of ranking of world cities, you see that Copenhagen, and together with cities not displayed, Vancouver and Reykjavik, Copenhagen is amongst the happiest places in the world to live, on average in 7.8 out of 10, followed by big cities as New York and London, and also cities like Sao Paulo and Paris and Berlin. A little bit striking, and I come in a moment back to that, is that if you would look at London, but also in Paris, is that the average level of happiness in these cities is actually on average lower than in the rest of the country. The Russian cities also score here in the middle group. So Moscow and St. Petersburg score 6 and 5.8. They are above the Russian average. And that is followed by Beijing, Minsk with a 5.5. And the worst places to live, but it comes to no surprise to any one of you in this room, are at the moment Baghdad, Cairo and Damascus in Syria. Well, if I zoomed in, especially for this occasion, on the Russian regions. So if you look at Russia, you see indeed that Moscow and St. Petersburg are the happiest places. So citizens there are on average the happiest in the country. The worst in terms of in terms of happiness score Central Russia, South Russia, and Siberia. Question is, of course, is happiness something that is stable over time or a threat that can change? And Russia is a very interesting case in that respect, because if we look at the Western world, then happiness is quite constant over time. So for Denmark and Netherlands, happiness hasn't changed much since the 1970s. And that's also remarkable because these countries, so Netherlands and Denmark, both experience considerably economic growth during this period. So that also means that, and we call this the Easterling paradox in happiness studies, that at some point, at some level of development, additional income doesn't bring additional happiness. And that's, of course, really interesting when you're also going to look from a consumption perspective. Is it these luxury goods that we need for our happiness, or is it, in the end, more the experiences that bring us greater happiness? Russia is a different case. Russia, you saw, after the post-Soviet time, you saw a decline in happiness. People were generally dissatisfied with the political situation in their country, but this changing political situation also went hand in hand with increasing inflation, but also decreasing GDP, increasing unemployment and poverty. What you see is that in the mid of the 90s, happiness rose again, although you had a dip at the end with the ruble crisis. With the start, I think, of the regime of Putin, you see happiness increasing again, although it is kind of bumpy. But it shows that happiness in a country can be improved. There is not something that happiness is a very stable threat. And that is also why politics should strive for making people happier, because it is possible. What makes us happy in the end? Well, that is a question that is also quite complex. But in general, we can say there are two types of factors that contribute to our happiness, namely, how livable is our environment, and do we have the right internal qualities to be happy? Are we mentally sane? Are we physically all right? And do we also have the ability to enjoy life? Well, when we first look at differences in happiness between countries, then we see that the wealth of the nation might be an important explanation. So in general, we see that the less happy countries are also less or least well endowed in terms of gross domestic product. Although if you carefully look, you see here some curvilinear relationship. So at some point, additional income doesn't bring additional happiness. Does inequality within a nation matter? Not so much. So what you see here is that there is not really an association with the degree of inequality in a country and the degree of happiness in a country. Quality of governance is though important. And when I talk in terms of quality of governance, it's not only democracy, but it's especially bureaucracy and corruption that is really important explanation for differences in happiness between countries, so why some countries are happier than other countries. Well, when we look at different kinds of relationships, then we find especially positive associations with wealth, the degree of industrialization, the size of the services sector, but also economic freedom, education, and urbanization. So these are possible factors that contribute to happiness or at least explain differences in happiness between countries. When we are interested in happiness differences within countries, so typically we see that differences within countries are usually much bigger than differences between countries. Then you see that it are especially the individual characteristics or difference in individual characteristics in life ability in particular that contribute or explain the differences in happiness between individuals. Also here you can distinguish between the livability of the environment and the livability of the individual. I marked here some aspects in red, and I did that because these are typically the aspects as an individual you can work on. There are also things like heredity, so genetics, learned ability, so how you were raised by your parents, so did you learn also to be happy, and good or bad luck. I can, after this presentation, I can leave this building and get hit by a car or a tram. That is bad luck, but also can affect my happiness level. By the way, if we turn in genetics, and you see that genetics explain about 30% in the differences in happiness between people within nations, then we should not think that there is a happiness gene. It doesn't exist something like a happiness gene, but there are genetic factors that make some people healthier in terms of mental well-being and physical well-being than other people. And that explains why genetics is an important factor in explaining differences in happiness between people. What do cities bring to happiness? And when we look at cities, there is some nice aspects. So what I showed here is the urban-rural happiness differences within countries. So are people more happy in the cities or are people more happy in the countryside? And you see some countries standing out. So in India, Mali, and Ghana, people are more happier in cities than they are in rural areas. You see also some well-developed nations like New Zealand, Uruguay, and Spain, in which people are actually happier living on the countryside than living in the cities. And that might have to do with for example, also pollution and congestion in cities that make cities not a very nice place to live. By the way, if you live outside a city, but in close proximity to a big city, you still have the access to the services within a city. You also see that in the Russian Federation, people score slightly above zero, but people are about as happy in cities as on the countryside. Moscow and St. Petersburg apart or left aside. You also see this in Rotterdam. I quickly skipped this side. This is the city where I live. And you see that here in the center, that is the city center. So that's called Rotterdam area. You see it on the right, almost in the top corner. That is somewhat the least happy part of the metropole area, while the suburbs in Rotterdam are slightly happier than the city center. What we see in Western Europe in general is also that people living in cities are generally less happy than people living in rural areas. Question is why. It can be because of a selection of unhappy people in cities. Cities do not only attract the part that is best off, so that they enjoy the amenities of culture and leisure and entertainment in cities. People also attract population that is less well endowed and who have the best chances to survive in cities. And so the urban-rural differences might not only be the result of really the livability of the environment, but it might also be the result of a selection of unhappy people in cities. Apart from that, you can look at the livability, so the quality of life in cities. Cities bring some nice things, it's especially a close proximity to culture and leisure amenities. And we know that experiential consumption really contributes to human happiness and is really important for people to thrive. On the other hand, cities also have downsides, like the pollution mentioned, like the crime, but also congestion in cities. It might sometimes be very difficult to travel from A to B. And what people really hate and what really depresses people is spending a long time in commute. So that is also what people report in terms of activities. This is typically the worst part of their day. So what governments can do about it? Well, first, why governments should care. I briefly talked about this in the beginning, but local governments are more and more in a situation to get the right persons to their city. And so the more attractive the city, also the more attractive people you attract. So if a city is interesting to live in terms of housing and amenities, then you can also expect that people really want to live in your city. And in turn, if you have a lot of human capital in the city, this might generate also more business activity within your city. Also, more happiness implies better health and higher productivity, which also means less cost and higher GDP. And in the end, what is interesting for politicians is that happier citizens are also more likely to vote for the existing government and not for a new government. What governments should know? Well, governments should also know how satisfied people are with certain factors. So not only with satisfaction as a whole, but also with these several domains of life and with these several aspects of the city. So how do the emotions of people connect to the different parts of the city? And they need to understand how inhabitants live and perceive their everyday life. So what are daily activities of citizens? How do they feel with these activities? Where do they do these activities? And with whom do they do these activities? And after obtaining this knowledge, they should also have some kind of instrument or democratic instrument to get a good discussion with citizens to improve the city. And that citizens can be improved has already been shown in this graph. Well, what can governments do in the end? They can improve happiness by first getting a better understanding of what drives happiness in their city. And this information can then eventually be used to start a discussion and also to devise some interventions. If it is, for example, known that people don't feel comfortable or happy in certain public spaces, then you can also devise a plan to change these spaces to give people a more positive feeling within the city. And eventually these interventions need to be evaluated. So when changing a public space, does it also make people feel happier in the end? Well, what can you think of here? If we think of actions in order to improve the livability of the environment, that are actions in terms that are most feasible for governments. It's actions in terms of infrastructure, consumption, meeting places, safe and clean environment, and also good governance. Those are aspects that a city can work on. Infrastructure in terms of commuting time. Try to make better public transport, try to make places better accessible, and also give people a more pleasant feeling when they are on their way from A and B. Consumption is really important. So when you think of culture is a really nice experiential good, and people enjoy that, and people become happier from consuming culture. But culture also provides a meeting place for people. So you saw that these social aspects of life explain much of the differences in happiness between people, and meeting places can contribute to the social capital of people. Safe and clean environment, in a way, in a similar fashion, and good governance. We saw also that people who are more satisfied with their government are more satisfied with their life. Apart from that, government can also work on improve the livability of individuals. Mainly takes place through education. So it can be a part in schools, it can be a part of the education of people, but especially in terms of good mental health care and life coaching. So also when you look at Russia and try to explain why Russia is less happy on average, then it's not only income, but it's also Russians are least satisfied, if you look at the different domains, with their health. And that is something that the government can improve. This is something that we try to connect to cities. Frankfurt is the first city we are going to work on. I won't go in detail about this project due to time constraints, but here we are also going to measure happiness in the city at different places and try to improve the happiness of these Frankfurt citizens. Thank you for your attention. And I'm open for any questions, of course.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I had actually questions on the slides with bars where you showed Zimbabwe and Moscow. Yeah. I didn't quite get what do you have on axis there. Could you please elaborate?
Yeah, I can elaborate. I will first go back to the slide that makes it much more convenient when talking. This one.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah. So what we ask, or what is asked in the Gallup survey is, please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 to 10, and the worst possible life is at the bottom, that's a 0, and a 10 is the best possible life. So what we show here is the distribution of how people respond to this question. So you see that not a lot of people in Moscow say that their life or happiness is a 0, and we see actually that most or the largest proportion of Moscovians give about over 20% gives their life a 5. So that's the largest group. The happiest? Yeah, the microphone is coming your way, I think.
So the question is, how does this distribution look versus the happiest cities in Europe?
So if you would look at Copenhagen, what would stand out is the 8. So 8. So everything is concentrated around 7, 8, and 9.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the interesting presentation. Here you focus on the study you made for the public sector in different countries, focused on cities, areas of cities. But have you had demand for such studies from a corporate segment, and maybe you could tell something about it?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So we are also working on happiness in organizations. There the idea is that happiness can increase productivity. So what we are trying to do there is first incorporate happiness questions in evaluation surveys or job satisfaction surveys. So typically what in organizations has been traditionally done is merely looking at job satisfaction. So how happy are you with your work? But now this is also be extended to more life in general. So how are you satisfied with your life in general? Also with the idea if we can provide our workers with such pleasant environment that they are also more satisfied with their life as a whole, they will also be better workers. So they will be less ill, they will be more productive, and even the good ones we are able to keep within our company. And I think also organizations like Google already have such a rationale.
Здравствуйте, спасибо за лекцию.
Yeah, I will find my translator.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear the translation? Martin, can you hear the wonderful. Okay. You can hear it? Can you hear it? 1, 2, can you hear me? Can you hear the translation? Good, perfect. So have you researched, is there any connection between the infrastructure of providing social and psychological assistance to the citizens and the happiness of life in a city? So was there any social services and psychological assistance? Does it impact the happiness level?
That's a very nice question. Unfortunately, there has not been a research on the relationship between infrastructure and happiness. The type of research that comes closest to it is, I think, the research that focuses on commuting time and happiness. So how much time people spend in daily work to travel journeys. And well, as I already explained, this is basically the worst time of the day of people. So it's the part of the day that people enjoy it less. But you can imagine that the better the infrastructure is, also the faster people can travel to their work, and also the more pleasurable the experience is. So I expect there that the quality of infrastructure and satisfaction of people is positively related.
У меня совсем
Well, actually, the question was about the psychological assistance service to citizens provided by the city authorities. Psychological assistance.
Mental well-being. Yes, there has been research on that, but mainly at the country level. Here, what has been found is that countries in which more money is spent on mental health care also are typically happier countries. So mental well-being is positively related, or expenditures on mental well-being is positively related to happiness.
Thank you a lot for interesting presentation. Coming back to the results of the survey regarding happiness in Moscow and also other regions worldwide, I'm curious to know what kind of people you have selected for your survey, and also how you actually conducted. Was it online survey? Because, can I make a little comment? I guess the people who would answer 0, 1, or 2, I believe you rather didn't, you didn't reach them, in fact, because they live in some areas, don't have access to internet. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, so what, okay, so first I should explain, I didn't collect the data myself. It would be also too extensive. So this is usually collected by either governmental organizations or by commercial organizations. This is the Gallup data, which is a commercial organization which does yearly surveys in countries. Yes, it is true that some people or some part of the population can be better reached than other parts of the population. The idea is that these surveys are usually a representative sample of the population. So normally, depending on the size of the country, they usually ask 1,000 to 5,000 people per year on how happy they are. For the figures that you here see for Moscow is basically an aggregate for the period 2006 2013. So you need a couple of years to get a kind of representative picture for a single city. The question is, of course, are the people who score 0, they are possibly less well reachable. It's completely agree with that. But what these surveys usually try to do is weighting, and that's also what I did in producing these figures. So for each observation that you have, for each individual observation, you have also a kind of figure how representative this observation is in the general population.
Last question. Thank you, Martin. My question was about the how representative was the sample. You answered it already, and maybe you can give some more details about how representative was the sample in Russian cities and Russian regions you mentioned. But my second question is about how your research corresponds to the happiness index introduced by the government of Bhutan to the United Nations during the Rio conference and so on. Thank you.
About the representatives in Russia, I don't know, but I know that these organizations, they usually use the same protocol in each country on how to randomize in order to get a representative sample. So I have no information that it was any different in Russia than it was in Zimbabwe or in Western Europe. With regard to Bhutan, Bhutan is a really great country in which already the government said in the 1970s that the primary goal shouldn't be GDP per capita, but it should be gross national happiness. These measures are closely related to that. They do not exactly represent what is measured in Bhutan, but they are closely related to the idea that is also exposed in Bhutan. If you would look at Bhutan, by the way, it's not the happiest country in the world. So they score about 6 out of 10 on the scales that I showed you. But you should take in that given even the development level of Bhutan in terms of GDP, then they score extremely high. So it's not a very well-developed country, but people are on average, they are satisfied or reasonably satisfied with their life. And you can also, Bhutan is an excellent example that you don't need to be rich in order to be happy, and that's a good message.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.